Today, we're dealing with a case that started as an ordinary welfare check, just a late-night call from a worried grandmother, a quiet apartment with no answer at the door, and 4 children no one had seen or heard from all day. What police discovered inside wasn't just concerning, it was horrifying. A baby girl, barely conscious and dehydrated. A toddler drinking from a toilet bowl. A 5-year-old hiding beneath a towel. And a 9-year-old girl holding her baby sister, whispering lullabies and apologies, trying to be the adult in a home where no one else was. Their mother, Shanice Edmondson, wasn't missing. She was across town in bed with her girlfriend, her phone on silent. And what makes this case even more disturbing is that it wasn't her first time. 4 years earlier, another one of her children died, a 6-month-old baby named Anaya. The cause was blunt force trauma to the head, yet Shanice walked free. No prison time. Just probation. A second chance. Now people are asking, how did this happen again? Why wasn't anyone watching? And how close did we come to 4 more funerals? This is a story of survival, of failure, of a system that ignored every warning. Because sometimes, the most dangerous thing in a child's life is the person who's supposed to protect them. Before we dive deeper into this chilling case, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that needs to be heard. Before she became the face of another tragic child neglect case, Shanice Edmondson was just a girl growing up on the edges of a broken map, figuratively and literally. Born and raised in the outskirts of Lakeside, Missouri, Shanice came into the world as her mother was going out of it. Her childhood was framed by chaos, food stamps, eviction notices, and the kind of silence that settles over a home when hope leaves. She was the second of 4 siblings, raised by a single father who did his best between shifts at a steel plant. He wasn't cruel, but he wasn't present either. Shanice spent most of her early years in the care of an aunt who had 5 kids of her own. It wasn't long before she learned the unspoken rule of survival: don't expect too much, and never ask twice. School was never easy for her. Teachers described her as quiet, withdrawn, often tired. But she wasn't unintelligent. She wrote poetry in margins of notebooks and sketched eyes, always eyes, in the corners of her math tests. One social worker would later say that Shanice felt things deeply but expressed them poorly. She wasn't failing academically because she lacked ability. She was drowning in responsibility. At just 14, Shanice became pregnant. It wasn't planned. It wasn't safe. But it was real, and it would define everything that followed. The father, a boy 2 years older, vanished before the baby bumps started showing. By the time she was 15, Shanice was living in subsidized housing with her newborn daughter, Kayla. She dropped out of school. No diploma. No job. No support. Just a baby on her hip and a future that seemed to shrink with every sunrise. For a while, Shanice tried. She took GED classes. She cleaned houses. She posted on social media about being a queen and doing it on her own. Her feed was filled with filtered photos of smiling children, inspirational quotes, and the occasional birthday balloon. From the outside, she looked like a young woman trying to overcome the odds. But life behind the filters was something else entirely. Between ages 17 and 24, Shanice had 3 more children, 2 boys and another girl. Each father was different. None stuck around. The state file described her as a chronically overwhelmed custodial mother with an unstable domestic pattern. In simpler words, she was always alone, always in over her head. Her relationships, too, were volatile. One boyfriend had a criminal record for domestic battery. Another was rumored to be a drug dealer. A third, a woman named Talia, was described as manipulative and controlling in later testimony. Neighbors recalled loud arguments at night, slammed doors, and long stretches where the children weren't seen outside at all. But it wasn't until August of 2019 that Shanice's name would enter the official record. That summer, emergency services were called to her apartment after reports of a baby not breathing. The child, her youngest at the time, was just 6 months old. Paramedics tried to resuscitate the infant on the scene, then in the ambulance, and finally at the Lakeside General ER. But it was too late. The baby girl was pronounced dead at 7:42 p.m. The autopsy revealed something Shanice would later deny: blunt force trauma to the head and ribs. The coroner's report was clear: the injuries were not accidental. They were non-consistent with a fall. There was internal bleeding. There were healing fractures. Police questioned Shanice for hours. She claimed she didn't know how the injuries happened. She said the baby fell off the couch. Then off the bed. Her stories shifted. Eventually, she accepted a plea. Her defense attorney argued for leniency. Shanice had no prior record. She was overwhelmed, mentally fragile, and under-resourced. Her supporters, few but loyal, painted her as a young woman broken by life, not by malice. The court agreed. Rather than prison time, Shanice Edmondson was sentenced to 2 years probation for felony neglect resulting in death. A plea deal, quietly struck behind closed doors. No media. No headlines. Just a grieving family and a sealed file. She walked free that day. Not because she was innocent, but because the system deemed her salvageable. And for a while, it looked like she might be. By mid-2020, she was enrolled in a parenting course. Child Protective Services monitored the home periodically. Caseworkers reported some improvement in living conditions. One noted that Shanice seemed attentive and loving, but distracted. There were no further reports of abuse. No red flags loud enough to trigger removal. The children stayed. And so did the silence. What no one saw, what no one was looking closely enough to see, was the slow unraveling happening behind her front door. The stress. The isolation. The fatigue that sinks into your bones when you're raising 4 children under 10 without a break, without a partner, and without a plan. She was close to completing her probation. Just 6 weeks away from a clean slate. And then it happened again. It was a sweltering Sunday in August 2019 when the first tragedy struck. The call came in at 6:58 p.m., a medical emergency at an apartment complex on Westfield Drive, just outside downtown Lakeside, Missouri. The dispatcher's voice was calm, but the panic on the other end of the line pierced through the static. "My baby's not breathing." The caller was Shanice Edmondson, then 23 years old. She met the paramedics at the door, holding her 6-month-old daughter, Anaya, in her arms. The baby was limp, pale, and unresponsive. Shanice cried hysterically as she handed her over. Her words were jumbled. She rolled off the couch, she said. "I tried to wake her up, but she wouldn't move." Inside the apartment, the scene was tense. Toys were strewn across the floor, a bottle of formula lay uncapped on the counter, and the room smelled faintly of stale milk. But it wasn't the environment that raised concern, it was the baby's body. The medics worked on her in the ambulance. Tiny chest compressions. A breathing mask too large for her fragile face. They tried for nearly 20 minutes. But when they arrived at Lakeside General, the attending physician could only confirm what they all feared: Anaya was already gone. Shanice collapsed in the ER hallway, screaming, "She was fine this morning." She told doctors the baby had taken a nap around 4 p.m. and didn't wake up. She insisted Anaya had only fallen, off a couch maybe 2 feet high. But the emergency room doctor noted something that didn't sit right: the baby's bruises didn't match the story. An autopsy was ordered the next morning. Dr. Carla Winslow, the medical examiner assigned to the case, had performed hundreds of pediatric autopsies. She knew the difference between an accident and abuse. This was not an accident. The baby had suffered blunt force trauma to the head. Her skull showed signs of a recent fracture. There was swelling around the brain, internal bleeding. Her ribs were bruised. Some healing, some fresh. There were also linear bruises on her upper back and lower torso, marks that Dr. Winslow described as consistent with the application of force. The report was unequivocal: the injuries were inflicted, not accidental. Shanice was brought in for questioning the same day the results were filed. Detectives described her demeanor as erratic, crying one moment, defensive the next. She stuck to her story: Anaya had fallen from the couch. Then later, she said the bed. She denied hitting the child. She said she loved her baby. "I didn't hurt her," she repeated over and over. "I swear to God, I didn't hurt her." But the inconsistencies mounted. She couldn't explain how a short fall could have caused a skull fracture. She didn't have a clear timeline of events. And when asked why she didn't immediately call 911, she admitted waiting nearly an hour, trying to wake her up first. By the end of the interview, she had changed her story 3 times. Shanice was arrested 2 days later. The charge: neglect of a dependent resulting in death, a felony under Missouri law. Prosecutors debated adding manslaughter, but without a confession and with no eyewitnesses, the case was circumstantial. Still, it was strong. The injuries spoke for themselves. The lakeside courtroom was small, unremarkable, rows of wooden benches and the faint smell of floor wax. But that summer, it held the weight of a life cut short and a community demanding answers. The prosecution painted a picture of a mother pushed beyond the brink, who lashed out in a moment of frustration. They cited stress, isolation, and lack of support. But they argued those conditions did not excuse fatal neglect. The defense countered with a plea: Shanice was young, remorseful, and incapable of violence. They cited postpartum depression, mental health evaluations, and her lack of criminal history. They claimed the system had failed to support her long before tragedy struck. In a move that drew quiet outrage, Shanice Edmondson took a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to felony neglect. In exchange, the more serious charges were dropped. There would be no prison time, only 2 years of probation, parenting classes, and mandatory check-ins with social services. For some, it felt like justice betrayed the dead. For others, it was mercy extended to the living. After the sentencing, Shanice left the courthouse without handcuffs. She walked past reporters in oversized sunglasses, holding the hand of her eldest daughter. When asked if she had anything to say to the public, she whispered, "I loved her. I never meant for this to happen." And maybe she believed that. Maybe she did love her baby. But love alone doesn't protect a child. And intent doesn't erase impact. The system gave Shanice a second chance. What no one knew, not the courts, not the caseworkers, not even Shanice herself, was that the most devastating chapter of her story hadn't happened yet. For most people, probation is a second chance. A quiet warning from the justice system that says, "We're watching, but we're letting you try again." For Shanice Edmondson, it was something else entirely. It was a thin rope stretched over an open pit, and she was already stumbling. By the time her probation officially began in November 2019, Shanice had already moved apartments. The old unit on Westfield Drive carried the scent of memory, one she couldn't scrub away, no matter how many times she painted over the walls. She relocated to a low-income housing complex on Daleview Street, farther from downtown Lakeside, more isolated, more anonymous. The court order was strict. No unsupervised contact with children under the age of 5 until cleared by Child Protective Services. Mandatory parenting classes. Monthly check-ins with her probation officer. Random home visits. Counseling. On paper, the system wrapped her in structure. But paper is thin. The first few months, Shanice showed up. She kept her appointments. She attended her court-ordered sessions and sat quietly in the back of community center classrooms where a counselor named Miss Phyllis talked about emotional regulation, meal planning, and loving discipline. Shanice nodded a lot but spoke rarely. When she did, it was usually about how tired she felt. "I don't have time to feel anything," she once told her probation officer. "I'm either changing diapers or trying to figure out how to feed them." In early reports, caseworkers noted gradual improvement. The home was modest but clean. The children were dressed, fed, and attending daycare or school. Shanice had applied for food assistance and was receiving WIC benefits. Her parenting coach wrote that she appeared motivated to regain control of her life. But beneath the surface, cracks were widening. She never returned to her GED classes. Her relationship with her current partner, Talia Moore, became a source of tension. Neighbors reported frequent shouting behind closed doors. A staff member at Kayla's school flagged a concern when the child arrived late for the third week in a row, wearing the same clothes and falling asleep during class. CPS followed up, but by then the house had been cleaned. Shanice smiled. The children behaved. No one pushed too hard. Probation, by nature, assumes progress. It presumes that the person being monitored wants to improve, and will do so with minimal oversight. But life doesn't always move in straight lines. Sometimes it circles back. Sometimes it spirals. By 2021, Shanice had regained full custody of all her children. The restrictions were lifted after social services deemed her home stable enough. The court was satisfied. Her probation was set to expire in just a few months. No new infractions. No missed check-ins. From the outside, it looked like success. But success has a way of masking survival. Inside the apartment, life was fraying at the edges. Shanice was raising 4 children, ages 8, 5, 2, and 4 months. The youngest had been born just last year, father unknown. Talia was still around, but inconsistently. She worked odd jobs. Sometimes she stayed for days, sometimes she left without explanation. Their relationship had become a cycle of reconciliation and rupture. Money was short. Food was stretched. Stress was constant. And still, no one saw the fall coming. Not the neighbors. Not the caseworkers. Not even Shanice. She was almost free, just 6 weeks away from completing her probation. One final home check stood between her and a clean record. A chance to move forward. But instead of preparing for that, she did something else. She left. And the children were left behind. April 8, 2024, began like any other day in Lakeside, Missouri. The sky was overcast, the sidewalks wet with early morning rain. Children filed into schools with backpacks slung over their shoulders. Workers rushed into corner cafes and bus stops. Somewhere on the east side of town, a probation officer logged into her system, making note of which cases were due for final review. At 10:27 a.m., Shanice Edmondson left her apartment. She took no children with her. She locked the door behind her and walked 2 blocks down Daleview Street, where a friend picked her up in a silver Hyundai. Their destination was clear, a 1-bedroom rental on the south end of Lakeside, where Shanice's on-again, off-again girlfriend, Talia Moore, was staying. Shanice had promised Kayla, now 9 years old, that she'd be right back. But she didn't come back. Not by lunch. Not by nightfall. Inside that apartment, 4 children waited. The oldest, Kayla, did what she always did when her mother disappeared. She took charge. She changed the baby's diaper, at least once. She gave her toddler brother a half-empty juice pouch from the fridge. She tried to warm leftover noodles for dinner, but the microwave was broken. She told the others to be quiet and keep the door locked. And then, as the sun dipped beneath the rooftops and the baby began to cry again, this time louder, more desperate, she made a choice. At 11:52 p.m., she borrowed her mother's phone, hidden under a couch cushion, and dialed the only number she knew by heart. Her grandmother. The woman on the other end of the line recognized Kayla's voice instantly. But what the child said next made her blood run cold. "Grandma," she whispered, "Mommy's not here. The baby's hungry." And Jeremiah was drinking from the toilet. 10 minutes later, the grandmother called 911. 2 officers were dispatched to the apartment complex, arriving at 12:14 a.m. The building was quiet, lights dimmed, no movement in the parking lot. From the outside, it looked like any other subsidized housing unit: aged siding, chipped balconies, children's bikes rusting on the lawn. But behind apartment 2B's front door, the silence was deceptive. Officers knocked. No answer. They knocked again, louder this time. Then came the sound, a baby crying. Muffled. Persistent. They entered with force. The apartment was in disarray. Piles of laundry, a moldy sink, flies buzzing around an open trash bin. The floors were sticky with something sweet and long spilled. The air reeked of urine and spoiled milk. In the living room, they found Kayla cradling her 4-month-old baby sister on the couch, gently bouncing her while holding back tears. "She's hungry," she said softly. "I don't know what else to give her." The toddler, Jeremiah, was shirtless and soaked. He stood beside the toilet in the hallway bathroom, his mouth wet, face flushed. There was no running bath water. No food out. No clean bottles. A third child, 5-year-old Liam, lay curled on a bare mattress in the back bedroom, thumb in mouth, eyes open but distant. There were no adults present. The officers radioed for child services and medical assistance. Each child was removed from the home. All 4 were malnourished. The infant was dehydrated and feverish. Jeremiah had open diaper rash wounds. Kayla, older, more self-aware, clung to her siblings and refused to be separated from them until she was promised they'd stay together. Investigators worked quickly to locate Shanice. Phone pings showed she had spent nearly the entire day and night at Talia Moore's apartment. When reached by phone at 2:16 a.m., Shanice sounded confused. "I was just out for a bit," she said. "They were sleeping when I left." She was arrested the next morning on 4 felony counts of neglect of a dependent resulting in endangerment. At the station, Shanice didn't cry this time. She was quiet, almost detached. She told officers she didn't mean to stay gone that long. She said she needed space. That parenting had become too heavy. That no one ever asked how she was coping. Then she looked down at her hands and said, barely audible, "I didn't hurt them." Maybe she believed that. Maybe, in her mind, what she did wasn't abuse. Maybe she saw herself as overwhelmed, not dangerous. But to the state of Missouri, it was criminal. And to the public, it was unforgivable. News broke within 24 hours. Lakeside mother arrested after children found abandoned, toddler discovered drinking from toilet. The headline was as horrifying as it was attention-grabbing. The case was shared across social media, debated on talk radio, dissected on parenting forums. Some called Shanice a monster. Others blamed the system for letting her keep custody after the 2019 death. But no one had easy answers. The police report was blunt. Shanice had left her children unsupervised for nearly 16 hours. There was no food prepared. No emergency contact left behind. No babysitter. No check-in. Just 4 children, fending for themselves in a collapsing apartment, while their mother lay in someone else's bed. Probation officers were stunned. She was weeks away from closing her case, one official said. This was the finish line, and she walked straight off the track. The children were placed in emergency foster care that week. A court hearing was scheduled for late May. Shanice was denied bond and remained in county jail. Her court-appointed attorney filed for a mental health evaluation. The prosecution, however, was already preparing for trial. Because this time, there was no dead baby, but there were 4 living witnesses. 4 neglected voices. 4 children who had been left behind twice. And now, the courts would decide whether they'd ever have to see their mother again. The arraignment of Shanice Edmondson took place on April 11, 2024, just 3 days after police found her 4 children alone in that decaying apartment on Daleview Street. The courtroom was packed, an unusual sight for a child neglect case. But this wasn't just about unwashed laundry or missed meals. This was about a woman who had already buried 1 child and now stood accused of nearly losing 4 more. She entered the courtroom in a loose-fitting orange jumpsuit, wrists cuffed in front of her. Her face was pale, eyes sunken. She didn't make eye contact with the gallery, didn't look for friends or family. Because there were none. The prosecution came in hard. They listed the charges clearly. 4 counts of felony neglect of a dependent. Child endangerment. Probation violation from the 2019 conviction. Assistant District Attorney Mara Keller addressed the court. "Your Honor," she began, "this is not a case of momentary lapse. This is a pattern. In 2019, 1 child died. This time, 4 children could have. The conditions they were left in were not only unsanitary, they were inhumane." She asked for no bail. The defense argued otherwise. David Riley, a court-appointed public defender, described Shanice as a struggling single mother with a documented history of mental health challenges, financial hardship, and no criminal behavior outside of these isolated parenting failures. Parenting failures. The phrase echoed through the courtroom like a sour note. Judge Elena Vargas listened carefully. She'd been on the bench for over 20 years and had seen her share of difficult cases. But something about this one lingered. The first child's death. The second chance. The breakdown no one seemed to catch. In the end, she ruled in favor of the prosecution. "Bail is denied," she said firmly. "The court finds the defendant poses a risk to her children's safety and is likely to re-offend." Shanice was returned to Lakeside County Jail to await trial. Over the following weeks, the case grew in visibility. It was no longer a local tragedy, it was a national talking point. News outlets framed it with headlines like, "A baby died. They let her walk. Now look what happened. Should mothers like Shanice Edmondson get a second chance? Failing the children, again." Opinion pieces flooded in. Some were brutally harsh. Others more sympathetic, pointing fingers at the overburdened child welfare system, at economic inequality, at the generational trauma that shaped Shanice long before she ever had children of her own. Meanwhile, the 4 children were split into temporary foster homes. Kayla, the oldest, was placed in trauma counseling. She cried at night and refused to sleep with the lights off. Jeremiah, the toddler who drank from the toilet, was treated for a gastrointestinal infection. Liam barely spoke. The baby, Imani, was put on a weight gain regimen. A family court hearing was held privately in mid-May. Shanice's parental rights were suspended. The judge made it clear, reunification was not the goal. The focus was now on permanent placement and long-term healing. Back at the jail, Shanice began weekly sessions with a forensic psychologist. In one report, the psychologist noted, "Patient displays symptoms consistent with chronic depression, emotional detachment, and maternal burnout. There is remorse, but also deep denial. She sees herself not as a danger, but as a mother the world has given up on." Whether that would help her legal defense remained uncertain. The prosecution was building a solid case. They had photos, medical records, CPS documentation, and, most damning of all, the recorded 911 call from the grandmother. Jurors would hear Kayla's voice. They would hear what neglect sounds like when it's reduced to a whisper over a dying cell phone. The trial was scheduled for September 2024. If convicted on all counts, Shanice Edmondson could face up to 30 years in prison. But the legal process would take time. And in that time, questions would continue to echo through the halls of Lakeside and beyond. How many warnings does the system need? How many chances should a mother get? And how many children must suffer before we say, enough? In the aftermath of it all, after the courtroom emptied, after the cameras moved on, after the headlines faded, 4 children remained. Children who had lived through things they should never have seen, never have felt, never have survived. And still, they had. Kayla, the quiet hero of the story, now lived with a foster family 2 counties away. She refused to speak her mother's name. She asked if she could change her own. The therapist said that was common, children trying to detach from the pain stitched to their identity. But nothing could erase the memory of that night. Of holding a crying baby. Of wiping her brother's face after he drank from the toilet. Of dialing her grandmother with hands that trembled like someone far older. Jeremiah learned how to say no in therapy. Before, he had only flinched. Liam still barely spoke. His silence filled rooms louder than words ever could. And Imani, the infant, would never remember any of it. But her body would. Her nervous system would grow wired by the early trauma of need unanswered. What do we do with stories like this? Do we blame the mother, whose own life was a long trail of unmet needs and broken systems? Do we blame the courts, for giving her probation instead of prison after her first child died? Do we blame Child Protective Services, overwhelmed and understaffed, for not digging deeper? Or do we admit something harder, that the failure is collective? That all of us, society, community, policy, played a role in looking away. Because Shanice Edmondson didn't break overnight. She broke slowly. Publicly. Predictably. The signs were there. And no one stopped it. Some say justice will be served when she's sentenced, when the prison door shuts behind her and her name disappears from public record. But others know better. Justice, if it ever comes, will not come in a courtroom. It will come when children like hers no longer have to be survivors. When mothers like her are seen before they snap. When the system built to protect doesn't just respond to crisis, but prevents it. That day hasn't come yet. But stories like this remind us why it must.